I'd like to get started in a minute here. First off, a brief introduction. My name is Matt Belanger. I'm a planner with Missoula County's Rural Initiatives Department, and we have some other members of our staff here tonight. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this program, and I wanted to get a few housekeeping things out of the way before we got started. If you need to exit the meeting space, your best bet is right over there at the exit sign. If you try to go out this way, you can get out, but you'll be locked out, so this door is definitely a second alternative. Also, if you need to use a restroom, they're right over here through the door under the basketball hoops. So again, if you want to get that way and not end up locked out of the room, that's the best way to go. I'd like to welcome everybody once again and thank our presenters who are here. We have Tim Davis from Montana Smart Growth, Randy Carpenter from the Sonoran Institute. We have students from the Montana School of Law Land Use Clinic, Ted Fellman, Justin Kalmbach, and Jason Brown, and there's Professor Michelle Bryan Mudd. They'll be your presenters tonight. Additionally, we have a facilitator for this meeting, so thankfully in a few moments my part of tonight will be over, at least until we get maybe to Q&A, and that's Marcia Hogan, and she'll be taking over for me. We do have cards, index cards and pens for folks to write questions down on as we go through the process and as these guys talk so that they can get through their presentations, and we'll have lots of time hopefully to do questions and answers at the end of the program. So thank you once again everybody for coming. Thank you to our staff. Thank you to members of the Seeley Lake Community Council who are here, and especially thank you to our 3 county commissioners who all made the trip up here tonight to take in this presentation and listen to some of this discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, let's get started. Okay, so we have folks here to share information with you tonight. We already, come on in. Hi, we just got started. That are going to share information with you tonight. We're not going to be taking any public comment or trying to reach agreement, but hopefully some of the things that you learned tonight will be helpful with that further on down the road. And the way we're going to do things is that we have about 3, come on in, just work your way around. One of the ways we're going to do this tonight is I have about 3 presentations. They'll each be about 20 minutes. So I'm going to let people give their talks. And if you have questions, think of questions while you're listening to them. I want you to jot them down. So I'm going to pass out these index cards because we can be the most efficient with our time if we let them get through what they have to say. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. So just jot down any questions you have and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations. Okay.
Can we ask questions verbally?
Yes, no, you can ask them verbally. This is just so you write them down and don't forget them, because we're not going to interrupt the presentations. Yeah, no, you'll all get a chance to ask your questions verbally once we get started. The other thing, just in terms of minding our P's and Q's, what does P's and Q's stand for? Does anyone know? I was thinking about this. I just ask that you not have a lot of side conversations. The acoustics aren't real good in a lunchroom. And also, if you have any cell phones, you turn it off. Okay, so I think Tim Davis with Smart Growth is going to talk first. Thanks.
I'm not used to using these things because I'm pretty loud. So can people hear me if I talk like this? No. Okay, I'll use it. I always feel like a bald Neil Diamond when I have one of these things. So I don't have enough spangles. I guess if with Elton John around, I guess I should talk more like Elton John. I'm with the Montana Smart Growth Coalition, which is a homegrown coalition of 40 organizations that came together in 1998 to have a presence on growth issues, primarily at the state level, but also to help local governments and citizens across the state start to handle and struggle with growth. And try to, basically virtually everyone lives in Montana for the exact same reasons, and most of you live here for the exact same reasons, which are the quality of life and open space that really define Montana. So the big struggle as we grow is how do we stay Montana while we grow? And how do we not become, as a friend of mine, a good colleague of mine likes to say, how do we not become Ohio with mountains? So what I'm going to show you tonight is basically, I'm going to walk you through some growth projections that show you what growth could likely look like in the future. Then I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this area is unique, and one of the reasons for that, that you haven't seen the types of growth that much of the rest of the state has seen, is because most of the land around here is controlled by most of the developable land is controlled by two landowners, Plum Creek and the state, and that have not, to date, developed much of their land, if any. So, and then I'm going to walk through just kind of the background about how can you get ahead of growth? What can you do about it? What do the statutes say about it? And kind of set up the rest of the speakers who'll get it more into cluster development and transfer of development rights, which I'm sure you've heard those terms thrown around a lot. So, and I'm happy to answer any question. I think we're going to take the questions at the end. And I like to say that no one asks tougher questions than my 6-year-old daughter. So I'm happy to take any questions. So. And I will mess up the PowerPoint presentation at least once, I guarantee. I always do. So we did growth projections that basically looked at the 31 fastest growing counties, what the governor often calls the cowboy boot. And we looked at where growth had happened in the past, why it had taken place in different areas. We ran a very sophisticated growth Poisson regression analysis that told us which were the driving factors that determined where growth happened and why, and then looked into the future and said if growth stays at the same rate we've had in the past, where will it likely take place in the future? And I'm showing you this mainly because if you opened up all the land for growth without zoning, without any attempt to guide growth in this area, we project that you'd look a lot like much of the rest of the state is already starting to look like. So I'm going to go through pretty rapidly. I'm going to walk through the past growth, and I actually brought mints for anybody who can identify up here the different colors of industrial, commercial, and residential dots. But so I'm going to start in 1905, go to 1915, and just jump. And you can see that growth is following most of the agricultural valleys, most of the rivers, railroads. And then as we get up to 1955, it starts to jump along highways much more and start moving out further and further. Then that really takes off in between 1955 and 1965. And then 1975, you can imagine a bunch of people showing up in Montana with P symbols and daisies painted on VW bugs. So it continues to grow fairly quickly. Then I'm switching to, and this is all present, this is all the growth that's on the ground at these times. Now I'm switching to densities. The darker colors up here represent more houses per, and now I'm just talking about houses, not industrial and commercial, more houses per quarter section. So we have 1985, 1995, 2005, so present day, and I'm always a couple years behind. So present day, this is basically what we have on the ground, and so now we were looking forward into the future and saying, why did growth go where it did in the past, and where is it likely to happen in the future? And so the change happens 10 years, 20 years. It happens pretty dramatically. But and I will drill down into the Highway 93 corridor, and you'll be able to see a little better this area. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how growth has happened in other places where there hasn't been where most of the land has not been locked up by one or two landowners who haven't developed, or where zoning hasn't taken place. This does take into account the growth projections take into account all zoning that was in place as of 2005 across the state. And you can see dramatically different growth patterns in Lake County here than in Missoula and Flathead counties. That Lake County has primarily for the Mission Valley, they have zoning all the way across it. So the growth projections projecting significantly different growth patterns because of it. So, and why did growth, what is decided where growth will most likely occur? And one of the, not surprisingly, infrastructure is the number one thing that determines where growth is going to locate. It's the distance to major roads, road density per square mile, and then travel time to one of the 5 big airports. The closer you are to one of the big airports, the more likely people are going to locate there. Is it in town, and what's the travel time to a town of at least 1,000 people? Those help to determine where growth went. And then, most relevant for up here, what's your travel time to the mountains, to a national park, to distance to a major water body, and up here, of course, that's always 5 feet. So you always fall into a major water body within 5 feet. And then distance to a forested area, that's obviously smaller than 5 feet. And then agricultural suitability. This is almost hilarious that if the better it is for agriculture, the more likely it is you're going to see growth on it. And that's primarily because that's where growth has happened in the past, and that's where the road density is, and that's where it's near existing development. And then what we call leapfrog development has how much development was there, how much development in the past, how close was it to development. So as development leaps further and further out, it's more likely to bring other development with it. So that's kind of the growth projections for the western part of the state. And one of the reasons for the growth pattern that we've seen is in the 25 years between 1970 and 2004, we saw the population of Montana grow by 45%, but the amount of land that we used for residential development grew by almost 200%. So we're using significantly more land for residential development than we used to in the past. And this is actually looking at forecasted growth in western Montana. The growth curve is probably going to continue, and there are many people, especially Dr. Larry Swanson from the University of Montana, who thinks this is too conservative. As baby boomers retire, and whether you believe in global warming or not, we're going to become the new Florida, I've heard. So people are going to be moving here in higher numbers, actually, in the next 15, 20 years. And I won't talk about what will happen to the baby boomers after the 15 and 20 years, but that. So this is looking at the Highway 93 corridor in order to drill down a little closer to home with the growth projections. So this is current on the ground. And remember, the darker it is, the higher the densities. And so this is looking at the projected growth patterns over the next 10 and 20 years. And you can see that the lower part of the swan is filling up by this, but this is also determining if those road densities get higher. If this was all opened up without any zoning, without any attempt to guide the growth in there, one big development in there could leapfrog to more development in those areas. So, whether you love this map or hate it, or you think it's just too complicated, I think this is the most recent map for the Seeley, the proposed Seeley Lake community plan. And I just put this up here to show you that the colors are, again, I have more mints if somebody can identify the purple. But this is primarily, many of you have probably already seen this. Most of this is purple, most of this, or a lot of in here are the Plum Creek lands. There are a lot of state sections in here as well. And so I just brought this up to show the growth, the map that you've created. And if you want to get ahead of growth, if you want to guide growth and you want to have a say in how the community is going to look like in the future, you're going to have to establish through zoning. Plans by themselves legally in Montana have no force of law. You can't use them as they have guiding documents, but until you implement them through regulations, they have no force of law in Montana. So this is Placid Lake. This is the potential receiving zone that was established. And this is looking at each one of these dots. We had a GIS person look at, okay, put one dot per 20 acres here, and saying if you didn't have any zoning, if you didn't have any, if you didn't get ahead of the growth in this area, anybody could come in and take those through the subdivision law, because that's the only thing that would be used in order to, the subdivision regulations, in order to determine where growth went. Somebody could take a quarter section of land, 160 acres, and cut it into a chunk without any review. It just goes through, it's a certificate of survey. And so it goes in, there's no review, then each one of those 160 acre chunks comes in for a minor subdivision, which could then go in, which is a pretty cursory review that's 5 or fewer lots. So imagine those 160 acre chunks in and around Placid Lake and up into the Swan, up by the Marshall Block, being chopped into 160 acre chunks without any review. Then each one of those comes in to be chopped up with minor review, because each one has to be reviewed independently as a minor subdivision. And that's why we threw in one house. Each one of those dots could represent a unit per 20 acres. This is without any zoning. This could happen, some of this won't happen. It won't be uniform across. But what we wanted to do is give you an idea of, without any zoning in place, this is what it could look like. And the little dots in here in the receiving zone, these are at one house per 1 acre, to give you the same idea. If you kept chopping these down, somebody could come in without zoning, and this is what they could propose, and it would go through the subdivision regulations, which don't have any density requirements in them. So, tools that work to get ahead of growth, to make sure that you're implementing the plan you want. Zoning is the tool to really have a say in the growth that you want. And it's really the best tool for establishing a baseline. What densities do you want where? What do you want to see protected? Zoning is the best tool for that. Transfer of development rights is a great tool for protecting large landscapes, deciding where you want to see protected, creating a market mechanism that gives people in those areas who own those properties to strip the development rights off of them and put them somewhere else. Obviously, there are 3 counties, and I'm not going to get into the details of these. There are 3 counties that have transfer development rights, or currently have them drafted up and are considering them right now. Those are Lewis and Clark County, Lake County, and Gallatin County. And I may be missing some, but those are the 3 that I knew about that either have them or are seriously considering them right now through zoning. And then clustering is think of clustering as you're going to leave, the landowner chooses to leave part of the land, usually at least 50%, in open space, in perpetuity, in exchange for incentives to develop the other part of the land. And really, I think the best way to think about this is a direct quid pro quo to the neighboring property owners especially, because part of that land that they're looking at will always remain as open space versus being chopped up. And I'll give you a picture of what that might look like. And I won't go into this too much, just zoning is the way that you're going to that you implement the plan. It's the best way to do it. Zoning actually our zoning statutes give a disproportionate amount or a proportional amount of power over whether the zoning passes or not. It goes through a protest provision to large landowners. So, and the part that's highlighted is probably the most relevant part here, saying if freeholders, basically meaning landowner, I have to work at the legislature, so some of the terms that get thrown out, nobody really knows what they mean, so we'll read freeholders as landowners. If freeholders representing 50% of the titled property ownership in the zoning district that's being proposed, whose property is taxed as forest land under Title 15, Chapter 44, Part 1, have protested the establishment of that zoning district or the adoption of the regulations, the Board of County Commissioners they may not adopt that zoning resolution. So it gives large landowners a protest over the zoning and I'll give you one example. In Canyon Creek over by Marysville, if you know where that is, outside of the Helena Valley, 3% of the people who lived in that zoning district protested out, stopped the zoning. So even though vast majority may have been in favor of it, because they own vast majorities of the land, those 3% were able to stop the zoning protest. We stopped the zoning from going into place. So this gives Plum Creek, in this area, whoever owns the vast majority of the land, the zoning is going to have to work for them in some way. It's just the reality of state law. And in order to get zoning in place, this is a reality of state law. And so as you move forward with implementing the plan, you're going to have to take this into account. And I wanted to give you a good example, and it's right next door to here, Powell County. Virtually all of Powell County is zoned. And the whole northern part of Powell County, which you guys all see, is your neighbors, it's virtually all at one house per quarter section, one house per 160. And what they did was they established that, and then they established basically rural town sites, where they said you can go down to one house per 1 acre, and saying, these are the few areas where we want to see growth go. And the landowners in this area, mostly farming and ranching community, they said, we want to stay agricultural. We want to continue to protect the lifestyle that we have here and the economy we have here. So they accepted the zoning and they supported it. So that's right. Your neighbors have a great example of how zoning can come from the community and grow up and get you the type of growth you want. And you can see the growth pattern that it's resulted in when you go over there. And then I'm going to skip through this one. This is I wanted to give you a good visual example of when we're talking about cluster development and the choices of it, of what cluster would look like and what not having any zoning could look like on a piece of property. This could be a meadow outside of Placid Lake. This is what is incentivized and could currently come through without any zoning in place. This is probably what would come through without any zoning in place, is coming in, chopping up the land into squares. You would get everyone on an individual, like 1 acre lot or larger primarily, because they'd be on septic systems. They'd each have an individual well. This is actually the easiest, fastest thing to do in Montana, and so this is what we get. This is when I showed you the growth projections. Most of our growth has occurred in the last 20 years outside of our towns. This is what most of it has looked like, because this is what the market is told to do. This is what potentially a cluster development might look like. And if you were this landowner, see this landowner up here, this homeowner is here throughout the entire time, which would you rather look at? This or this? So I want to give you a real visual representation, because I think everyone is afraid of being this person down here. So you have a choice. This is one of the tools that you should consider, and I'm happy to answer any questions when the questions come around, and I probably burnt my time, and so, but thank you.
For the benefit of those who just joined us, we have several presentations that are going to take us about an hour, and when they're all over, we're going to have questions and answers.
And if you can't see, there's a bunch of bleachers over there, too. Good evening. My name is Michelle Bryan Mudd, and I'm the director of the Land Use Clinic at the University of Montana School of Law. And you're actually not going to hear much from me this evening. I have the pleasure of bringing with me 3 students that are third-year students that are about to finish law school who work in the Land Use Clinic. All third-year students do a clinic experience before they get their law degree, where they do live client work. And these students had an interest in land use. So they have been assisting Missoula County with questions that it has about what types of tools would work really well for the Seeley community, a community that is very unique and wants to preserve its uniqueness, wants to preserve that strong sense of place that it has, and the long-term economic and social values. And so tonight, Jason Brown will be speaking first about the concepts of TDR and TDC, which are sort of interchangeable words, and clustering. And after he is finished, Justin Kalmbach is going to get up and talk about the legal rationale for using these tools in Montana, what allows communities to use them at all. And then finally, Ted Fellman will finish by sharing with you what we think are some of the successful characteristics of a good TDR and clustering program based on other programs we've reviewed around the country in communities that have values similar to yours. So thank you for coming tonight, and I'll invite Jason to come up.
Thank you, Michelle. My name is Jason Brown. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Montana, and happy to be here tonight to provide you all some information about transfer development credit programs. A Like Michelle said, you've heard TDRs a lot. We're using the two interchangeably because we have found ordinances that call this concept a transfer development credit program. And since it's really about transferring development rights around, and those are kind of like a currency, the credits are a type of currency that's transferred, but I will get into that. For now, I'm going to use TDC, transfer development credit. Basically, both clustering and TDC are zoning tools that are available. They're just two zoning tools. There's a whole array of tools available to a region to plan for future growth. And these are just two tools that you can use to implement the community's goals. And these goals are set forth in a variety of places, but specifically the regional plans, as well as growth policies. And Seeley regional plans currently in the works. But some of these goals include protecting rural and natural values in Montana, and in this area in particular, and over a large area. And we'll see why that's important later. Preserving open space, which is good for tourism, scenic value, and wildlife habitat. And encouraging growth in areas that can accommodate growth. It's more efficient to provide public services in those areas, such as sewer, water, transportation, etc. So these are all community goals that will be articulated in the regional plan, in the growth policy, and TDCs and clustering are tools that the community can use to achieve those goals. These are some terms that I'm going to be using tonight, but I'll come back to this. I'm going to go skip to the next slide, but I've talked about community goals and how those focus on natural resource areas and as a whole, broad areas. So how do they work? A transfer development credit ordinance basically recognizes, oops, oh, there it is. There's supposed to be a laser. Anyway, if you see the house here, it recognizes these development rights as part of kind of the bundle of rights, or if you think of your property rights as a bundle of rights, like the right to access the property, the water rights, the mineral rights, the agriculture and timber rights. The development rights become their own stick in the bundle, so to speak. And there hasn't been a house built yet, keep in mind. It's the potential to develop, the possibility of developing that becomes exchangeable and is severed from one piece of land and transferred to another in another area. So the way this is done is by designating sending areas and receiving areas. The credits are created in the sending areas when the landowners there agree to not develop. And then that development right or credit is transferred to a receiving area where increased development, greater density can be better accommodated, closer to infrastructure, closer to services. Here's an illustration of kind of how it's working. The white is the sending area where you have wildlife values and scenic open space. And before houses are ever built on those properties, they're turned into credits that are transferred to a receiving area where you already have hopefully infrastructure and services. And in exchange, there's money exchange. That's the incentive for people to create credits and to agree to not develop. So like I said, this is a zoning tool. It's in addition to the underlying zoning designation. And the way I think of this is, if you think of the zoning designation as a map with a bunch of colors on it, this is like a clear sheet of paper that's laid on top of that map. So it's in addition to the underlying zoning. So for example, if it's zoned residential, this doesn't change that designation. However, it affects it because we're talking about changing densities. So if the underlying use designation is 1 per 10 in a receiving area, this would allow you to maybe go 2 per 10 once you've used your credit there. Usually they're voluntary programs, but not always. Ted will talk more about that. And he'll also talk about how it's a market-based program, meaning the price isn't set. It's determined mostly by supply and demand and market forces. So I want to talk about how these areas are designated. They're designated by the county, by the community, following public process, and Justin's going to talk about that. But like I said, they're overlays, and they're designated, their sending areas, like I said, are designated where there's scenic value, there's wildlife value, open space value, it's the area that you don't want to see development. And you can make this a large area. As we'll see with clustering, it's more limited. So sending areas are the more open space values, and then the receiving areas are designated based on proximity to services. They're areas that can accommodate growth, and they're areas where development pressure already exists. That's pretty important. And so that the developers will value the opportunity to increase density there. You wouldn't want to make a receiving area where nobody wants to develop anyway. You want the developers to want, you want them to want that increase in density, and that's important. Credits, like I said, are created by agreeing not to develop the property in the sending area, and they're the currency for what you hear referred to as development rights. A credit then is tracked by the local government. That's how these programs minimally are administered. The creation of credits is tracked, and then how they're used. And you can use credits, like I've said, you can apply them to increase density to add additional units above the zoning baseline in the receiving area, or you can sell them. And you can sell them to pretty much anyone, so you don't have to use them. They have value in various ways. Most programs also give the option of retiring a credit, which conservation groups may want to buy credits and then retire them. Meaning the landowners agree to never develop. You create a credit, take the development right, but then you never use it. You never use it in a receiving area, so you achieve a protection value. Pardon? Okay. I was going to summarize, but I think you all got that. I just want to talk about clustering really quick. It's different from a transfer development credit ordinance in that it just applies to a particular parcel. You're not shifting density between broad areas, you're just shifting density within a parcel. And it shares the same goals generally as a TDC, but it doesn't allow the same area-wide preservation. It creates pockets of open space. So it's usually measured by the percent of open space that's left. For example, like Tim said, it's often something like 50% open space. That's how the clustering technically works. And it affects more than just density. Like the incentive for clustering may be that you don't have to meet the setback requirements or that you get an expedited subdivision review. It's not always just density, whereas a transfer development credit program is just dealing in density. It is similar to the TDC though, promotes similar goals, less sprawl pattern, and it's looking to put development where it can better be accommodated. And it may be actually required or an incentive program. Sometimes it is required in areas that want to discourage development or areas that just value the open space and managing the growth pattern. But usually, often it's an incentive. For example, if you wanted to build like 10 units on 50 acres, you might be able to build 15 units if you agree to preserve half the area as open space. So I hope I've clarified some of the differences and put the TDCs and the clustering in context as tools available to the county to meet its goals. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin, who's going to talk about the legal authority.
I applaud my colleague's ability to stand out in front of you. I need a podium myself. Okay. So now that Jason's told you a little bit about TDCs and clustering, you might be wondering, well, where does a local government get the authority for something like that? And it's a three-part answer, and we'll go through it step by step. So the Montana Constitution gives counties a group of powers called the police powers. These are powers which local governments can use or can enact laws. Is that better? All right. Thanks, Ted. So the police powers are powers that local governments have, and they use those powers to authorize laws that are for the health, safety, and morals and general welfare of its citizens. The power to zone land falls under the umbrella of police powers and is codified in the Montana Zoning Enabling Act. But before a county can exercise its power to zone, it must have something called a growth policy, which is required under the Growth Policy Act. A growth policy is a master plan, a visionary document that must include the community goals and objectives in regard to zoning. And in regard to, the zoning regulations must be in accordance with the growth policy, and they must be designed to meet a list of factors the legislature has set forth. One of the factors the legislature requires is that the governing body takes into consideration the character of the area they're zoning. So while Missoula County has a growth policy in place already, smaller communities are allowed to add on to the growth policy for their own region so long as the community plan is in agreement with the county's plan. This allows each region to tailor the growth policy to its community-specific needs. And the Seeley Lake Community Council has been working on the Seeley Lake Regional Plan for quite some time now. One thing that a growth policy allows a county to do is to outline the way a jurisdiction is going to reach its stated goals. Say, for example, that a community's stated goals are the protection of natural resources, animal habitat, and scenic viewsheds. The growth policy allows for that community to state what land use planning tools it is going to use to achieve that goal. And since the Missoula County growth policy specifically mentions the use of TDCs and clustering, the Seeley Lake Regional Plan has incorporated them as a way to achieve that community's stated goals. Therefore, as long as TDCs and clustering are reasonably related to enhancing the public's health, safety, and welfare, a TDC program or clustering is likely to be held as a valid exercise of the county's police powers. In fact, Missoula County is certainly not the first county to have implemented a TDC program in the United States. Other states have determined that counties have the authority to employ the use of TDCs and clustering to meet their goals. For example, other states are Washington, Idaho, and even the several.
Can you hear him? Move your mouth close to the mic.
All right,
Right up to the mic.
eat the mic, okay. All right. So, and we also heard about some other local Montana places that have used TDCs and clustering. And some of these have survived judicial challenge, and in fact, one in our own circuit, and that it was in a different state, but that county was trying to protect the rural and agricultural area. So now that we've established that TDCs and clustering are permissible exercise of the police powers, how does a local government go about it? And more importantly, what role can you, the citizen, play in the process? So rather than having the planning board in Missoula determine what the Seeley community wants, the Seeley Lake Community Council has been working with community to develop a regional plan. You, the citizen, can get involved by attending the committee meetings and the subcommittee meetings and providing your feedback. When the Seeley Lake Community Council feels that they have a complete plan, they will submit that plan to the Missoula Planning Board. During the Planning Board's review, there will be opportunities for public comment. After consideration of the public comments, the Planning Board will make a recommendation of whether to adopt or to not adopt the regional plan to the County Board of Commissioners. If the Commissioners adopt the plan, it will then be codified through zoning, and under the Zoning Enabling Act, there will be more public process before it is officially adopted. You, as concerned citizens, should make the most of the process to ensure your voice is heard. So one point I want to make is that the Seeley Lake Community Council is an advisory board to the Missoula County Commissioners. They cannot adopt the growth policy themselves. And there is still a considerable amount of time left in the process for all of you to get involved. So go to the Seeley Lake Community Council meetings, give your feedback, and participate in the process for Seeley's future. Thanks a lot, and I'll turn it over to Ted.
All right, I see, you really do have to eat this thing. I'm going to speak a little about some of the successful characteristics that we've discovered through a review of a lot of models that other areas of the country that have used both transfer development credit programs and clustering. And we did do a pretty extensive review, but we focused particularly on communities similar to Montana. We looked at states in the Intermountain West, Colorado and Utah, communities that had similar values to see what sort of characteristics were successful there that we could apply here. And so that's what I'm going to be speaking about. The first thing I do want to say, though, is that transfer development, credit programs, and clustering have different goals and can do different things in terms of guiding land use. And for a TDC program, what you're essentially doing is protecting entire areas entire large areas and transferring that growth to areas that have already been deemed more suitable for growth. Whereas with clustering, we're looking more at an individual parcel by parcel basis and creating perhaps pockets of open space within a developed area. So these are important considerations in terms of how you would apply these two very different tools that can both help meet some of the community goals. So I'm going to start with transfer development credit programs. And one of the first principles that we identified that helps make them successful is that they're voluntary. Some are mandatory, but the voluntary ones generally have less opposition, and the participation in those programs is more meaningful and helpful because people have done so voluntarily. And that ties into another principle, which is that they're often based on market principles. And these market principles show themselves in a variety of ways. On one hand, when there's sales of credits between willing sellers and buyers, that determines the price, and that price is variable depending on the market. But there are some factors that affect these prices, and some of those are which areas are designated as receiving areas and how those receiving areas are zoned certainly affect the price that people are willing to pay for them. And community can play a role here in terms of guiding this transfer, in terms of putting incentives on the use of credits. For example, you could determine in a sending area that restricting a parcel might get just 1 credit or it might get 3 credits. Obviously, that incentive is going to determine how much they're used and what their price are. On the flip side, you could do the same thing in a receiving area by determining what that credit buys you there. Do you get 1 extra house? Do you get 2 extra houses? A lot of different ways that you can incentivize on both ends of the equation and help influence that market. The market model also makes things simpler. It also can have the effect of making it easier for people to participate in these programs when there are less administrative burdens because more of the day-to-day management depends on market principles. Another successful characteristic that we identified is that there must be sufficient receiving areas to create demand for the credits that are created by protecting areas in the sending areas. In general, we found that the most successful programs have more receiving areas than sending areas so that they can absorb any credits created and encourage credits to be made by protecting these areas. Also, the price of the credit will increase when there are more areas to transfer that development into. And if the price increases, that encourages more use of these credits, and that in turn feeds the protection of the sending area. So the whole program can get sort of an incentive spur to grow. Another successful characteristic that we identified is flexibility. And this is, in a lot of different ways, it shows itself. For many communities out west that value less government involvement, transfer development could be a way to give more flexibility for land use by allowing the market to determine which specific properties are going to be protected or developed more intensely within these larger areas. So there is some flexibility. It's left to the owners of the property to determine, do they want to protect, do they want to develop more intensely there. Credit values can also be flexible, both because of the market principles that I outlined and in the way that those credit values are designated, what their use will be. And another aspect of this flexibility is that there can be variable scale. You could have, say, a program that is just for the Seeley area, or you could have one for the whole county. In general, we found that the larger scale tends to be more successful because it creates more options for both sending and receiving, and that flexibility helps to make these programs more successful. Another point in terms of successfulness is that some of these programs allow different communities to work together, in particular between more urban areas and more rural areas. One model we looked at in Colorado in Mesa County, there was a rural area of Mesa County that valued its agricultural lands and protecting those agricultural lands. And the nearby town of Fruta was interested in having more development there, that there was more infrastructure there. So the county and the town made a deal so that they would set up a sending area to protect some of these agricultural lands and transfer that to the town, which was looking for more development. So it does create some opportunities to cooperate with other communities to meet the goals of both. Another thing that's very critical is public information and education. The most successful programs, people know they exist, they understand how they work, they know where to go to get information about how to use them, and the more that you have that information, the more likelihood that you'll have a successful program. And the last thing in terms of successful characteristics of a TDC at least, is that they're the sole incentive for an area. The problem is when multiple incentives say multiple ways to get increased density, if density is your incentive, if there are multiple ways to get there, you're going to undercut the use of your transfer development credits program if a developer can get that same density by using some other tool. So maximum success, you want it to be the sole incentive. I'm going to move now to clustering, and this last point that I made actually ties in with some of the successful characteristics of clustering, because there is this tendency to maybe have competing tools here with clustering and TDCs. And so one of the successful characteristics for clustering would be that you coordinate it with your transfer development credit program if you're using both. One way to do that would be to not have any clustering in receiving area, but rather have your clustering take place outside of the receiving area, so that in your receiving area, it's just the use of credits that would get you more density. However, you could also, if you wanted to have clustering in addition to credit use in your receiving area, you could make clustering a requirement rather than an incentive tool. And that way, you're going to get your clustering, but not undercut the incentives of using credits. There's also ways that you can combine these two approaches to have variable combinations. Another successful characteristic of clustering is that you want your clustering provisions to be easy to quantify. I believe earlier that Tim said that usually it's 50% of the acreage of a parcel would be designated open space. And that's a simple way to do it, to have a designated percentage of the total acreage that will remain open. That makes it easier for people to use because they understand what they're required to do to get that incentive. Another successful characteristic is to make sure that the cluster incentives are used where growth is appropriate. And this can be a way to reward developers by relaxing other requirements, perhaps setbacks, or making the administrative burden less. These are some of the incentives you can use to guide the growth where you've already determined that growth is more appropriate. One more additional characteristic of success is that it implements other community goals. For instance, the most valued portion of a parcel would be protected, and perhaps that value is based on it being a riparian area, being a wildlife corridor, or a gateway area, but these community values can be reflected by where it is determined that the clustering will occur to keep the open space in these valued community parts of individual parcels. As well, we've seen that some of these incentives, because they can create opportunities to have more dense development in certain areas, can bring housing costs down, and some communities that value affordable housing, this is one way that can incentivize the creation of affordable housing by allowing for more dense development, which can be more affordable. And lastly, in terms of characteristics successful for clustering, is that successful clustering programs would protect contiguous areas of high resource value. By creating a no-build zone where there is a desire to protect a resource, you create larger areas that have a specific resource value, and you protect those larger areas within a parcel by the use of clustering. So I just want to remind you once again about this fundamental difference in terms of TDCs are very good for larger areas and transferring from one area and guiding it to another area. Clustering is more appropriate for the parcel by parcel approach to create some, both of which would implement certain community values. And these were some of the characteristics that we found by looking at some of the models across the country. And hopefully it'll be helpful for you as you consider these tools in implementing them here locally. And I believe that Randy Carpenter is going to speak next from the Sonoran Institute. Thank you.
While we're getting our PowerPoint hooked up here, I'm Randy Carpenter. I'm with the Sonoran Institute. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. We're a nonprofit in Bozeman, Montana. It's our Northern Rockies office. Our headquarters are in Tucson, Arizona. Hence the name, the Sonoran Institute. We work with communities throughout the West on helping them manage growth and change. We're a nonprofit. What I'm going to talk about tonight, real briefly, is Gallatin County, Montana, Bozeman. Growth management plan, the commissioner's plan to manage growth within the county. Thank you. Let's see. Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk briefly about Gallatin County, Montana's growth management plan, and specifically the idea is to implement that plan using countywide zoning. And two of the provisions that I think are appropriate to talk about tonight are the transfer of development credit proposal within that countywide zoning, and also the clustering provision within that countywide zoning. And I should stress that this is the county commissioner's plan. It's not the Sonoran Institute's. We provided some assistance on developing the plan. It really is a county commissioner's plan that they've come up with after several years of a community outreach effort as to how they're going to manage growth. Before I get into that, I'd like to talk just a little bit about what I think the motivations were for the commissioners to put together this countywide zoning proposal. And that's just the amount of growth they're having and the pattern of growth that they've been undergoing for the last several decades, really. Just real quickly, the population's doubled in the last couple decades. They've lost over 100,000 acres of productive farmland in the last decade. And the fastest growing county in the state right now, matter of fact, Gallatin County apparently has passed Flathead County. We're now number 3 in the state in terms of population. And looking ahead, if we continue this growth rate, Gallatin County is looking at about 30,000 additional homes in the next 30 years, or pardon me, the next 20 years. And so it's not just the rate of growth, the speed at which the county is growing, it's also the pattern at which we're growing. Tim showed you this graph that was similar to this, in which it shows that the population is growing at a smaller rate than is the rate of growth, that is the acres of land that is being developed. So since 1970, the county's population has grown by 139%, but the number of acres that have been developed has grown by 271%. So we're growing fast. Each home is taking up more space, and when we look at the mapping that we've done for Gallatin County, we can see not only is it growing fast, and it's taking up more space, the pattern is changing, but the homes are becoming, the subdivisions are becoming more dispersed farther out into the valley. So as Tim mentioned, we mapped every structure in the county throughout the 20th century. It allows us to use statistical analysis to project growth into the future. When we zoom into the north part of the county, we can see these traditional development patterns where most of the homes were occurring in our towns or in small little hamlets like Willow Creek down there. That's the traditional pattern of growth that really held throughout much of the 20th century, most of the 20th century. As we can see when we move through the 20th century, all the way up to, let's say, into the 70s. And that last quarter of the 20th century is when we start to see the real dispersal of homes farther and farther out into the valley till we get to where we are in 2005. And as Tim mentioned, using this GIS, Geographical Information System mapping and statistical analysis allows us to project growth into the future. And this is our model's best guess as to growth through 2025 in Gallatin County. So all things remaining the same, keeping the same policies, the same development patterns, fast growth, taking up more space, and much more dispersed throughout the county. That is, again, if there are no changes in policy. So if we look into the future, I think that what the commissioners have really considered is, well, what if we do keep growing like this, and what if we get most of our growth still is happening out in rural areas? So we took a look at it. If over the next 20 years, all of those homes, those 30,000 homes, were to develop at rural densities, that's about 150,000 acres of development. If, on the other hand, the county were to grow at those traditional patterns of growth, in which most growth was occurring in towns, that's only 9,000 acres of development. And of course, obviously, that comes with less impacts on agricultural land, on water, on taxpayer dollars, on wildlife, on a whole host of issues that really make Gallatin County a special place to be. So the crux of the Gallatin County Commissioner's Plan is let's guide growth into our existing communities, and when growth does happen out in rural areas, because we know it will happen, there is a market for that, let's try to make it happen in a more sensitive manner that protects more of our agricultural land and our open space. So, two objectives: guide growth into towns. When it does happen in rural areas, let's reduce the impacts on, again, agricultural land, open space, water, et cetera. The two strategies they're going to use within their countywide zoning plan is the transfer development credits and rural clustering. And if we could get a quick show of hands, do you all feel like you got a pretty good handle on what both of these tools are? The transfer development rights around and the clustering? Okay. Let's see if Gallatin County's example might make it a little bit more concrete, because this is an actual proposal. Just real quickly, graphically, to illustrate what the commissioners are trying to do, when we look at the little town of Manhattan on Interstate 90 in Gallatin County, these green homes represent townhomes, and the red represent rural homes, okay? And this is their growth area, the town of Manhattan's future growth area. As we look into the future, at present rates of growth around Manhattan, that's what we're looking at over the next 20 years. The commissioners are trying to achieve something that looks more like this. Okay, so guiding growth into the existing towns in traditional neighborhoods, traditionally designed neighborhoods. Okay, so it's very important if you're guiding growth into towns that you have development standards that sort of mimic our traditional neighborhoods, which in Bozeman and throughout the county happen to be the most sought after, most desirable neighborhoods in which to live. And that's reflected in the property values. It's older neighborhoods is where people seem to want to live. And the good news is we know how to do that. We have subdivisions in Gallatin County that are based on those traditional neighborhoods. So the idea is to guide growth into towns, into neighborhoods, traditional neighborhoods that are walkable, have plenty of open space. Okay? So the way they're going to, one of the tools they're going to use to do that, to guide growth into towns, is the transfer development credits proposed program. And I should note, all these are proposed. I think that the commissioners are going to adopt this sometime later this year, but they're still in the stage of putting it together. It's been about 3 years now, but they're nearing the end of really putting this together and making a final decision on it. So here's Gallatin County again. They've set rural zoning outside of the designated growth area that you see in the yellow here. That is Bozeman and Belgrade and the Four Corners area. So that's essentially the growth area. Outside of that, they're saying one home for every 160 acres will be the zoning outside of the growth area. So we want to guide growth from those rural areas into the growth area. One of the tools, again, is using transfer development credits. You know, the county has some experience with transfer development credits or transfer development rights programs, okay, on a small scale, on a sort of a subdivision by subdivision scale. As an example, this is a Saddle Peak subdivision north of Bozeman, in which this Mule Deer overlay zoning district, parts of the zoning district, a developer of this subdivision here bought the rights from this landowner here and was allowed to do more homes than the underlying zoning allowed them to do. So we have several examples throughout the county in the past on a smaller scale of successful transfer development rights program. Importantly, I think the commissioners really are basing their plan on a study done by Solomar Research Group, a consulting firm that specializes in these transfer development credit programs. So they took their time. They were very thoughtful into putting together this program because you got to get the numbers right. And what I mean by that is you want your supply of sellable credits, okay, from the sending area to be somewhat equal to the demand in the receiving area. If you have way too much supply out in the sending area, the rural areas, compared to the demand, the price is going to be very low. And it's likely landowners aren't going to want to sell them. And then the other way around. If you have way too much demand, not enough supply, the price is going to be so high that developers may not want to buy them. So what this company did was they analyzed what developers are going to be willing to pay, what they can pencil out if they're going to, when they buy these credits, okay, how much they can pay for them. And then they analyzed the supply-demand ratio, okay, to come at an estimate figure of what they think these things will fetch in the open market. In this study, they believe that in the open market that Each one of these credits that a landowner gets and sells will bring anywhere near $5,000 to $25,000 a piece. It depends on the area in which you're at in the county. So I think they did a good, thorough analysis of the program before they really put it together. So real quickly, in the sending area, the number of credits that a landowner in the receiving area gets can be based upon the acreage or the value. So let's say you have a section of land, 640 acres. It can be the number of credits that you receive or that you're allocated that you can then sell might be based on one credit for every 20 acres you own, or on a value-based. If your land is valued more, the development values are more, for whatever reason, you've got views, or you're on a spring creek or whatever, you would get more of these credits. So there's two ways in which you can be allocated the credits, and then you can sell some of the credits and still do development on your property. So let's say you have that section, 640 acres. Let's say you have 80 of these credits that you can sell. It's 1 for 160 zoning, so you could build 4 homes on there. So you could build those 4 homes and you could sell your credits, but you could only sell 76 of the credits. In other words, you'd have to retain 4 of your 80 credits. So it's not an either-or program. You can sell some of your credits and still do some development on your property. There will be a clustering provision that I'll talk about in a bit, and it's the same thing. You can still do the cluster and sell some of the credits. Okay? And one important consideration here, the commissioners have decided that on those areas where you sell all of your credits and you retire the right to develop on your property, it's not a permanent retirement. Okay? So it's not a perpetual deed restriction on your property. It's only a 40-year restriction on your property. So you can sell all your credits, and for 40 years, you have extinguished the right to build on your property. But after that 40-year period, like we know what's going to happen in 40 years, but theoretically after that 40-year period, you would be then given back the right to develop your property. It's an important distinction. Then in the receiving area, of course, a developer in the receiving area can build at the underlying density. If they want to do more than that, they would go out and find a landowner to buy these development credits. Another important thing is they can buy one of these development credits. That gives them the right to build 4 more homes. And that was a way, they devised that as a way to sort of balance out this supply-demand ratio. Okay. Then the other aspect of their countywide zoning program, again, is the clustering. They're calling it the Rural Conservation Development Program. Again, it's a proposed program. Again, in Gallatin County, there's some precedents for this. We have a number of subdivisions in Gallatin County out in rural areas that were clustered. This is the Eagle Rock subdivision, not all that far from Bozeman, in which approximately about, I think it was about 80% of the total area of that property was left undeveloped, and the rest of it was developed in, I think it's about 30 homes on much smaller lots. So the design standards for the Gallatin County's Rural Conservation Development Program, their clustering program, in other words, would be, first of all, you get a density bonus. So if you're in a rural area outside of that growth area, this does not apply to the growth area, it's for the rural areas, you can develop at 1 for 160, as I said, or if you do this clustering, you can develop as many as 1 home per 40 acres. If you meet the clustering standards. Okay. And those standards are, at least 90% of the original parcel's area must be permanently deed restricted. So you can develop on 10% of the original property, and the rest must be permanently deed restricted. Okay. I did it again. For the most part, if you're going to get that big a density bonus, your property is going to have to be on a paved road. If you're not on a paved road and you don't get the full density bonus, you'll still get a partial density bonus. But this is an important one. It's a 90% minimum, and if you're on a paved road, you have the ability to get as many as one home per 40 acres. And then another important design standard, there are several others, but really the other important one is that there must be open space connectivity. That is, if you develop your homes in one corner of your property and leaving the rest as permanent open space, that open space must connect with neighboring permanently protected open space if it's there. So if there's a state land or Forest Service land or conservation easement, your open space must be adjacent to that open space. And just real quickly, a couple of illustrations of that. This is sort of a typical rural subdivision. I mean, we've all seen these. This is a 20-acre subdivision. It's about 30 homes on this section, this 640 acres. So let's say we can back these out, take these homes out, and the countywide zoning would allow them to do one home for 160 acres, or on that section, that's 640 acres. They'd be able to do 4 homes, or they'd be able to do the clustering program and be able to get more homes than that. I should note that we've kind of taken these clustering provisions, those standards, 90%, be on a paved road, and numerous other ones. We've applied it to a number of different properties throughout the county, including this one. And what we've found is under the Gallatin County criteria, it's pretty hard to get that big a density bonus, to get to one home per 40 acres. It's more like maybe you can get to one home per 80 acres or one home per 60 acres. For instance, this subdivision here, this section, if they're clustered, it'd allow as many as 16 homes if you got the full density bonus. And I think we could only get something like 11 or 13 homes on there, no matter how we tried to organize the houses. So pretty strict criteria. It's a generous bonus. If you do the clustering, you get a 300% bonus, as much as a 300% bonus, down to 1 for 40. But having said that, I think it's going to be quite difficult to get that big a bonus. So I think most of the clusters are going to be more like 1 for 60 or 1 for 80, something like that. So if you have any questions about this, you can call the Gallatin County Planning Department. And the best thing to do is ask them to guide you to the documents that spell out these provisions. And I could give you the web address, but it's about 900 characters long. So if you're interested in it, just give them a call. And that's all we have.
Okay, just by way of reminder and also for the benefit of people who came in a little late, tonight's a chance to learn about some of the planning tools that you might want to consider using as you shape growth in this area. So this is basically a question and answer session. We're not here to take comment on what you do and don't like about clustering or transfer development rights, but to learn more by way of the questions you have. So what we're going to do is, some of you probably have more than one question, but I'd like, I'll just call on people, but I'd like everyone to get a chance to ask the one question they might have before I have someone get a second question. So just raise your hands and I'll bring you the mic, and you can, and if you have someone in particular you want to answer it, just say so, or we'll.
This one's for Randy. What's the base zoning for the receiving area in Gallatin County, or what are they proposing?
Sure. It varies throughout. In the area around Bozeman, it's 1 for 20. But essentially, you can, without too much work, you can get down from 1 to 5, 1 home per 5 acres is the base density. But you could go up to maybe 6 homes per acre if you buy those credits. Depends on the infrastructure, and it's going to vary within that growth area, whether you're outside of the Belgrade area or the Bozeman Donut or the Four Corners area.
Answer your question? Yes. Okay. All right.
This is for the gentleman from the Law Institute. Could you distinguish between a conservation easement and a transfer of development credit?
Who was this for?
Students?
Well, there's various ways to protect the land in a sending area, and a deed restriction is the least burdensome. It's filed by the landowner himself or herself, and it generally is in perpetuity. We saw in Gallatin it's for a 40-year period. You could use a conservation easement too. Conservation easements generally include more language, more requirements, more maintenance and management criteria. So, and there's usually an organization or a public or private group that takes on the burden of making sure that the terms of the conservation easement are met over time. And you can do a lot with a conservation easement. I mean, you could say that you could really regulate the activity that will take place. Whereas all a deed restriction probably does is says that the landowner says, I agree not to develop. There's no terms about how it's used in the future. It's just talking about development. So you could use a conservation easement as a part of a transfer development credit program to protect a sending area, or it could just be a separate thing. People use conservation easements to get tax breaks, and there's requirements for that. But does that explain how they're different?
Does a conservation easement allow you to do any transfer of development credits?
You could. It depends. Each community, the community could decide that. Does a conservation easement allow you to transfer? Yeah, traditionally conservation easements exist on their own, and people do them to get tax incentives, and they just get paid. There's no credit for that. If it was incorporated into a transfer development credit program, then yes, it would be the way that you would protect. You'd agree not to develop through the use of a conservation easement, and then you'd get a credit for that you could sell or apply to a receiving area. So generally, they're their own thing, their own creature, but they could be used as part of a transfer development credit ordinance.
Another distinction, if we could look at Gallatin County again, Gallatin County's got a purchase of development rights program. That is, the county will buy a conservation easement from a landowner. A landowner decides to give up their development rights, voluntarily agree not to develop, and the county will pay for those development rights. The county has sent out two $10 million bonds that will purchase those development rights. The transfer of development rights or credit program, on the other hand, the same thing, only now it's a developer who is purchasing the right for those development credits, not the county.
Did anyone else want to add anything?
I just wanted to clarify, if a conservation easement is established through like a transfer of development rights or credits, the person making the exchange does not get the tax credit, the tax benefits of the conservation easement. A conservation easement has to be voluntary to get the IRS tax benefits. So, I mean, that's one of the benefits of using a conservation easement versus a deed restriction is you have someone in perpetuity, an organization that holds that easement and will make sure that the stewardship takes place, that the terms of the easement are not violated. The deed restrictions have and can get lost because there's nobody watching them. I mean, those are two practical differences. So.
You get old and slow after a while. I'm critically aware that Missoula County voted a year and a half ago to not have charter government in the county commissioners. So our county commissioners are beset with implement Montana law, but can't legislate. Now, Gallatin County may be able to legislate, but I don't think there's anything in Montana law that allows transferable development rights. So I think we're talking about an idea that doesn't exist in Montana, at least in Missoula County. Is anybody can straighten me out on that?
Who can answer that? Michelle.
I will do my best. Justin talked about this a little bit, but essentially, counties do have that authority in two ways. In the Growth Policy Act, that counties are empowered to create growth policies. It specifically states that counties or cities, regardless of their form of government, can list out tools that they want to use to promote appropriate placement of development or infrastructure is, and to preserve areas where there is wildlife habitat and resource values. So in the Growth Policy Act that applies to counties, it states that our state wants counties to reference those tools in their plan. Once it's in the plan, then the Zoning Enabling Act says you have to codify the goals of your plan through your zoning. And the zoning powers have been held throughout the country to encompass incentive zoning tools like transfer development credits.
The city of London does have a charter government, and they can legislate. The county does not. And that's the difference between creating law. There's no reference in Montana code annotated about transferable development rights.
The question is, there's no reference to transfer development rights in Montana code. But counties do have the power to legislate. That's what your subdivision code is. Well, Missoula County right now has a subdivision code that governs subdivision, and they have a zoning code. So they're legislating in a variety of ways already. And what the courts have said is that your zoning doesn't have to list every possible tool, because you just simply have to ensure that the tools you use are promoting the health, safety, and welfare of the community. So a community isn't limited to specific tools that it can use. It just has to tie those tools to a rational basis. Is it going to promote the community's welfare, their health, their economic well-being to use these particular tools?
Did anyone want to add anything to that? Okay. All right. You got two questions. The second was clarifying.
I'm not really sure who this is to, but maybe just to the whole panel, and hopefully someone can help me understand. But there was a lot of talk about market-driven and supply and demand, and I guess to apply those issues to our area here, I have a little bit of a difficult time understanding how, when the same entity owns the area to be transferred out of and the area to be transferred into, how does that apply in this situation? Could you guys maybe shed some light on that, and if precedent exists for that in other areas?
Who wants to take that question? Want to try?
I will try. I don't know that a precedent exists, and it's not, I mean, you're right that this is not we're talking about transfer development rights, they're talking about transfers between two, primarily, entities. And this is a transfer, this could be an internal transfer, within Plum Creek, or it could be a transfer, for example, from lands that may be held by Plum Creek into state trust lands, or from state trust lands into Plum Creek lands, or there are some private lands I understand, mixed in there. So but if it's between the same entity, it's not a traditional transfer of development rights, but you're giving you're essentially giving that entity, Plum Creek, use them as the example, the incentive to protect one area in perpetuity in exchange for being able to develop where the market tells them that it makes more sense for them to develop. So the mechanism's the same. It's just an internal transfer. I don't know of any specific examples where that's happened, but the mechanism and the result are the same, if that makes sense.
Randy, do you want to add?
Sure. I should have noted that in Gallatin County, it does allow for the transferring credits between parcels that are under the same ownership. So I don't know what that owner is going to charge himself when he buys his own credits. That's not exactly a free market, supply and demand situation, but it is allowed.
As a follow-up to that question then from Scott, in this instance where Plum Creek is transferring internally and they are the 50% or larger landowner in the area, then the values or the credits then by necessity have to be negotiated. Otherwise, they would have the authority to squash the whole thing. Is that correct?
Considering that was a large part of what my presentation, yes, that's the way our zoning statutes are drafted. If you have 50% or more of the land mass within a zoning district, if you protest it out, I mean, I was showing you the possible growth projections to show with zoning, and you can guide growth, but the caveat is in our state statutes, our zoning statutes, is that if you have 50% plus 1, I mean, it's not 51%, if you have 50 plus 1 inch, you can protest out the zoning, you can stop the zoning. So there is a balance that has to be made. And whether it's in Gallatin County, where they're dealing with primarily large ranch lands in the rural area for the zoning, or Lewis and Clark County is undertaking zoning for the whole Lewis and Clark, Helena Valley, having to have those same discussions with the large landowners. So it's whomever is the large landowner in the area that makes up 50%, whether it's one entity or 10, if they make up that 50 plus 1 inch, they can protest it out.
And of course, conversely, that one landowner, whether it's in Gallatin County or Missoula County, can also guarantee that that zoning will be enacted and guarantee against a successful protest. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but there's two sides to the story.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague to the right. There is another zoning provision that allows 40% of the landowners, and this is where the whole freeholder and, come to the legislature with me sometime and you can have a fun walk through Latin that nobody understands except for attorneys. And so there is a second zoning provision where zoning can get protested out by 40% of the landowners within that district. And the other caveat is zoning is established by the commissioners. It's a representative. They have to make, whether it's Part 1 zoning, which we didn't talk about, which is citizen-initiated zoning, even then, even if they petition for the zoning, the commissioners have the final say. It's their, that's why we elect them. We have a representative government. The same is true with Part 2 zoning, county-initiated zoning. So, does that answer?
Yes, okay. Thank you.
Randy, would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. All right.
It's the guys to my left always want more government, you notice that?
Yeah, the guys from Wyoming.
The TDRs, TDCs, I'm getting from this that are all based on within a county. Is there any effort or any consideration to making this either statewide or multi-county, since the county boundaries are relatively arbitrary and the land masses you were trying to protect don't recognize those boundaries?
Michelle, did you want to answer that? I saw you lean forward.
I think we're probably going to come down the same way. We didn't in our review of nationwide systems see any like that, but I could imagine that working through an interlocal agreement where two counties get together and agree to have comparable zoning schemes that would allow that type of a transfer. It's sort of
City county. We saw that in Colorado between a county and a town, so the same principles could apply. Just haven't seen it, but two governments could have a memorandum of understanding to transfer between them.
There's one precedent for where counties have adopted the same thing across the zone. It's river setbacks, and it's the Big Hole River. It crosses 4 counties, and they've all established the same procedure. And I believe the statute for interlocal agreements states that anything that any individual jurisdiction can do, 2 jurisdictions can do together through an interlocal agreement. So, it's not right, Alan? Is that right? Okay.
Okay.
I've been doing a little, excuse me, bit of research on TDRs, and I think I know what your answers are going to be on this question, or questions. Some of the words that I've read in some of the documents are, from an environmental standpoint, specifying sending areas is paramount, and having more receiving lots than sending opportunities is critical. Unfortunately, what works well in theory may not be effective in practice. The reality of the situation is that TDRs have been primarily effective within urban settings. There are few successful TDR programs in rural areas. A working market requires that receiving areas face a demand for denser development than is currently allowed. The locations designated for receiving areas should be next to existing developed areas, near transportation and other infrastructure. Without infrastructure, the receiving zone will not work. Receiving areas should not be located in sensitive watersheds or in areas with other environmental constraints. Those are not my words. Those are from papers I've read. Do you agree with the statement, without infrastructure, the receiving zone will not work? And to follow up, do you think that using TDRs to move development from one environmentally sensitive rural area to an adjacent sensitive rural area is an effective and justifiable use of a complex TDR program?
Yeah, I don't quite agree with the statements in there. Let me start with the statement that the most successful programs have been transferring development rights from rural areas into urban areas. In fact, the most successful programs in Calvert County, Maryland, is where they're transferring credits from one rural area to another sort of suburban, exurban area. In other words, well, this is what's happening, whether it's good or bad. You'd have to ask those people. What's happening is, let's say that in Calvert County, most of those receiving areas are zoned at something like 1 for 20, and a developer could decide to go up to 1 for 10, have to buy development credits. Well, that's not an urban area. The infrastructure is probably pretty minimal in those areas, county roads and no water or sewer lines, just septic and wells. So I think it kind of depends. We typically think of a Gallatin County situation where you're going from a rural area, putting it into an urban area, getting a higher density urban area, when in fact, actually what's happened is you take that receiving area, goes from a very low density to a sort of low density development situation. Now, I'm not passing judgment on whether that's good or bad, but the facts are that's what's been happening.
What would you like clarified?
So we have documentation here of people that are commenting about that.
Is there another specific question you have to a point you raised?
I can ask the question a second time if they didn't hear it.
I think your point about the infrastructure is important. Clearly, the receiving area
Just
can
a
be more
minute.
successful if there's infrastructure there. And all the models that we looked at, the point about infrastructure is an important one. Clearly, it's going to be more successful, a receiving area, if there's infrastructure there. And a lot of models show that. But these are tools that are implemented to implement the community's goals. And so it depends on the goals of the community. And we're not standing up here saying that any set goal is the one way to do it. But yes, infrastructure, a lot of these plans are used to transfer into receiving areas where growth has already been deemed appropriate, and one of the signs of that is that there's already some infrastructure there. So in terms of guiding growth, infrastructure is helpful, but every community has its own values that they're going to implement through these tools, and so you know, you got to look at what the community itself wants to accomplish.
I was just going to add that a transfer development credit program doesn't replace regular subdivision review or any other approval process. And so there will be people looking at the infrastructure that will approve the project based on available infrastructure. So this doesn't guarantee that, you know, there's still infrastructure review and subdivision review happening.
I think the only other point to make is that, and we certainly are cognizant of this when we look at other models, is that, as Tim mentioned, it's a somewhat unique analysis for your community where it's possible that your market involves a very few landowners. And so some of the research about what markets work best we found to not necessarily be applicable to your particular community.
I'll sit because I can't stand walking around and talking with this thing. I mean, I do think the point being of implementing the vision that you have, the plan that the community has for your future growth, transfer development rights is just one tool. I mean, if your vision is to protect certain areas and you want to see them protected in perpetuity, you create and you have areas where you want to see growth go, and the market wants more dense development in that area, whether it's urban or it's at higher rural densities. You create a mechanism that incentivizes that transfer of development rights into those areas. And that doesn't mean that that you don't create design standards or development standards in the receiving zone that don't protect wildlife corridors, that don't protect the sensitive environmental areas, whether they're wetlands or stream sides, those types of things. It's a tool to implement the community's vision. And some places I could see where it would be, we would say it's absolutely inappropriate. But whatever the community is, I mean, that's where the planning process comes in, saying if this is what you want, this is a tool. You're going to have to guide growth if you don't want it to go literally hodgepodge and be anywhere and everywhere. Zoning is the tool to do that, to implement your vision for the future. Transfer development rights is one tool within the, and I do think within the zoning powers, the Zoning Enabling Act is very flexible. The Subdivision Enabling Act is much less flexible. To address the earlier question, I tend to side with Michelle that I do think that you have clear authority under the Zoning Enabling Act because it is so flexible. Whereas the Subdivision Act is much less flexible. So, but it's a tool. I mean, if the community wants to use it in appropriate ways, that's how it can be used.
That's right. You're hearing about tools, and all of you are going to decide you like some of them and not others. And we're basically trying to get you as much information as you can about these so you can make some judgments about them.
Howdy. Thanks for coming, you guys. We've heard that TDCs can be more successful when used at a larger scale. I'd like to know, to understand better for this area in Missoula County as a whole, what needs to happen to facilitate the transfer of development rights outside of one planning area and into the county as a whole, because I'm not sure that we can do that yet. And so what do we need to do?
I think one important consideration that I think is proven throughout the country and that Gallatin County is taking a lesson from is that there ought to be some sort of clearinghouse. Perhaps it's a bank that brings sellers and buyers together. When I said that it allows a developer to go out and find a rural landowner to buy development rights from, that's not really the way it's going to work in Gallatin County or in most places. There's a central clearinghouse that brings those people together. I think that's a really important criteria.
Well, I'd say the first step is it needs to be zoned. The whole county needs to be zoned. You can't have these tools without zoning in place. And so the county is in the process of trying to zone the whole county, and they're starting in Seeley. So the other part of it would be to get involved in that zoning process and make it clear that you want to see some of these receiving areas in other parts of the county, that you want this tool to be part of countywide zoning. And I think that's a possibility. It just needs to come from people inputting into the process. I think we're moving a little backwards. I would say that you have to plan for it. So you have to look at, I mean, the county's growth policy is not terribly detailed. It takes different neighborhood plans, different regional plans, and ties them together under a planning framework. I would say the county would have to look at their growth policy more deeply and plan for those areas that are appropriate for growth, where the county wants to see the growth, and where are those areas that they want to see development transferred from. I would say that'd be the first part, and then your zoning under state statute has to be in accordance with your growth policy. So then it establishes the framework for that transfer of development rights process to happen. So they need to look more broadly, I think, look at the growth policy and look at the planning process more broadly, not just in this area, if that's where they want to go.
Michelle, did you want to get those covered? Okay.
I heard today things like market, penciling out. So in looking at TDRs and TDCs, in arriving at these numbers, are we looking at the land and saying highest and best use? Or are we looking at it and saying reasonable use? Because I believe the state law constitution allows us the reasonable use of our land, and somehow or other, everybody, a lot of people, developers, county officials, whatever, have this mindset of everything has to be highest and best use. And that's not always the right thing to do when we're living as a whole collectively together. I think we need to remember reasonable use. So when you're determining these numbers, what are you looking at, highest and best use or reasonable use?
I don't think any of us obviously are involved in a process of setting any particular numbers, but what we've seen in reviewing other models is that they really don't use the term highest and best use or reasonable use. They look at what's the most valuable part of our community that we want to set aside and keep it the way it is. And that most valuable part of the community then has the potential to create the most credits. The alternative is for the community to go buy it all, right? And so this is probably the next best tool. You aren't buying it, but you're giving the landowner an incredible incentive to move it somewhere else. But there are consequences for that you have to give the landowner a value in return, and that value is moving it. So what we see in our review is the notion of highest value to the community, whether it's we want to preserve our agricultural heritage, or we have an endangered species that we want to continue to live in our community, and we're going to set aside that corridor movement for that species. It's the value to the community.
I was just going to add, you think about how the market will work, and when setting the number of credits you get for restricting a certain amount of acreage or a certain number of development units or certain values, or the number of units you get for credits, it's important to think about what is going to make the market work, what's going to create a healthy price for the credits so that the people that have land in the sending area have a good incentive, they're going to get plenty of money, and on the other hand, the developers pay a reasonable amount to increase their density in the receiving area. So in terms of setting those penciling out, think about how the market will work.
Hi, I think this question is for Randy or Tim. Randy, you made mention that in the Gallatin County program that 1 TDC equals 4 units in the receiving area. My question is, from the sending area, how large is an individual sending area and how many credits are translated from that? So is it one TDC per 160 acres, or is it a different computation?
Randy, Tim?
Yeah, so you're asking about the selling area landowner, the rural landowner, how many credits do they get to sell? You can do it either of two ways, and it's up to the landowner to decide which way to do it. It can be a mathematical formula. You get 1 credit for every 20 acres you own. So if you owned 160 acres, you would get 8 credits. Or if you feel that your land is more valuable than the median, than the average, because again, you've got incredible views or hunting or fishing or Spring Creek or whatever, or more than likely, you're in much closer to town, then you can use an appraisal-based method. That is, if you show that your property is worth more than X an acre, whatever that base level is, then you would actually get more than 1 credit per 20 acres. But you have your choice as to which method to use.
I just wanted to add that it could also be determined by the number of dwelling units that you're allowed under zoning in the sending area. Randy suggested the 2 methods, one being acreage, one being an appraisal and the value of the land. A program could also look at just the fact that you get, say, 1 development unit on that land. And so for restricting 1 development unit without reference to acreage, without reference to value, it's just for restricting a development or a dwelling unit, you get a certain number of credits.
Creating TDRs is a complex task. TDR is the most difficult preservation technique to establish. Successful TDR programs cannot be created by the will of an agency. Political legitimacy must be built over time. Public buy-in is vital. The success or failure of TDR programs is colored by excessive expectations. Public participation in the processes, particularly in receiving areas, is vital. Do you agree, or do you think that TDRs are too complex for the public to grasp, and that a top-down approach is useful at any point in the process?
Yeah, I think that's the case with any of these tools, that there has to be buy-in for the vision of the community and the plan of the community. And then again, the tools are just that, just tools to implement that vision. So I think that's the case with any tool that you'd use. Yeah.
I mean, TDRs are complex. They're not straightforward. It's not a straightforward purchase of development rights, for example. It's not straightforward, just base density zoning. And to make the market work for the receiving zone, to make the market want to remove the development rights, you have to make the receiving zone pretty much by right. It has to be fairly simple to develop in that area. If it's onerous, if it's very difficult for somebody to develop in the receiving zone, the market's probably not going to want to bear that if it's easier to develop at lower densities outside in the sending zone. So yeah, I mean, there has to be community buy-in, and it has to be part of a community plan and envisioning process, whether it's on a regional level or at a countywide level or larger level even than that.
I just want to add that I think this is part of that process. And the community right now is working on its growth plan. And then that's going to go to the county commissioners. There's going to be more public process involved in that. And then after the plan's in place, there's going to be zoning, and there's going to be a process of public involvement in that. So this is early. Well, I mean, the process has begun, but it's still early enough to have a lot more opportunities like this and other opportunities for public comment, for people to understand and get involved and build that buy-in. So I agree with the concept, and yes, it's complicated, but there's still plenty of time and plenty of opportunity. And I've been impressed, at least in my short time, with seeing how much involvement has been sought.
I just wanted to add about expectations that everybody's reiterated. This is just one tool, and if people are expecting this to completely solve the problem of development in, rural areas, mountainous areas that you want to see preserved as open space, I think the expectations are too high, and that it's going to take a combination of tools to really, and the reason I say that is because it's a voluntary program. So people could opt to go ahead and build where they are. And so for that reason, if your expectations are pretty extreme, then this probably will disappoint you. Other than that, I agree with the general statements about TDRs.
Okay, another question. You didn't ask one before, right?
Not yet. We broached it, but I don't know that I got full resolution on the idea of who establishes, and I think, Randy, you mentioned the fact that you have to have value placed on the land, both sending and receiving land, as you go through the process. Who establishes this value, especially when the owner of both is the same person? Isn't that a little bit challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the same question this gentleman had before on, and, it's just like a situation where I mentioned in Gallatin County, a landowner can sell credits to himself, and how they decide to set the value of that credit, I guess, is up to them.
I mean, again, it's just you'd be basically giving that one landowner the incentive, the market incentive, not to develop at the base density, but to transfer those development rights. So if the incentive's not great enough, they wouldn't do it. If it's great enough, they would. I mean, at least that's the market theory, right? Supply and demand. So if the demand is great enough in those areas for the higher densities in those areas, they'll transfer the development rights, whether it's internal or not.
So to some extent, if you had, say, a more urban or suburban area where there was a developer that wanted to go on the market, right, and get additional credits and build more densely, then it's what that developer is willing to pay and what the seller is willing to sell for. So it's a private negotiation. To the extent you have one landowner, I'm going to just put it out on the table that I think the particular landowner we're talking about has two divisions legally. So it could be that those two legal divisions, we don't know, again, it's private, but that those two legal divisions actually have an appraisal process that sets the values so that they can show that to the IRS. That would be my thought.
As a follow-up to that, if you have the same landowner in the sending and the receiving, and that same landowner has the ability to protest any program that is going forward, it then becomes, it would seem, inherent on the community to be put in the position of trying to determine the market values that are appropriate in that situation. Might it not be a better possibility to look at some other tool such as density shifting that does not imply the same market basis and try to work something out on that rather than imply this marketing component?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a transfer of development rights is essentially density shifting, right? We agree with that. Whether or not one division of a company sells to another division, I'm not sure is the point here, that mechanism. The point is the density shifting. And whether or not there's a price to be paid from one division to the other, I'm not sure that that's relevant here, as long as there is adequate incentive for that agent to transfer the development rights from one place to the other place where the community wants it.
I mean, I think in some ways with one landowner, I think you're talking about the same, in some ways you're talking about the same tool, whether it's transfer development rights or clustering, that it's just a transfer development rights between one landowner is really clustering. I mean, you're saying, I won't develop in this area in order to get more density over here. And most clustering provisions, whether it's Lewis and Clark County or Lake County or Gallatin County is considering, you would get density bonuses to cluster to get that incentive to cluster, rather than spreading the development across the landscape, whether it's 160 acres or 100,000 acres, creating an incentive to shift. And so an internal transfer of development rights is in many ways a large cluster development. I mean, that's what you could consider. I mean, Plum Creek may have, and I like talking about, it's always fun to talk about somebody when they're in the room and talk about them as a third party. So I won't use some personal examples. But the reality is, I mean, if they have to make it work internally, however they're set up as a corporation or several corporations, you're asking them to make that decision, to either transfer or cluster away from certain areas. And to try to make the incentive strong enough that's in they find that to be in their own interest to do so. So it's in the community's interest to say, this is what we want at the end of the day from growth, and so we're going to make this strong enough that they do this thing. That's my opinion, at least.
I was just going to say generally that there are ways to stabilize the price of credits, and some communities have credit banks or clearinghouses where you'd have to go to create the credit, and then sometimes the bank will actually buy up a bunch of credits, and then you'd have to go to the bank so you could, instead of trying to find somebody who's created them and is going to sell them, you can just go to the bank and there's a place where you can find credits. And I think that can have the effect of stabilizing the price, and it might affect the situation we're talking about here.
So in the process of establishing TDRs or clustering, which that means that they would get double the bonus points or whatever you call it, when do you know? I mean, when did Bozeman say, okay, this is only going to be for 40 years? I mean, when does the seller and the sellee make that determination? And I mean, we have to really ask those questions first.
I think that 40-year lapsing time is fairly unique, and I don't think that I would find that to be a successful characteristic of a TDC program, because the community is losing the benefit of its bargain. If you're going to give up something and take more density, I think that the county would, to protect its citizenry, say that deed restriction is permanent. It's there forever. There is no time lapse. It could be that Gallatin County thought that wouldn't be publicly palatable there, that the market wouldn't work unless they had a more weakened, time-sensitive restriction. But certainly, most of the models that we saw had no such time lapse on it. They were permanent.
You tell us why they went with 40.
I would generally agree with Michelle that, it is in the public interest to have a permanent easement, of course. I think the situation in Gallatin County was the market influencing the politics. And that was the concern expressed by rural landowners that they were hesitant, very reticent about doing a permanent easement. I mean, perpetual is a mighty long time, as far as we can tell. It's never been tested, but there was just a lot of concern that they would not actually sell those credits, and then you have a lack of supply and more demand. So it influenced the politics to make it a term 40-year easement.
Someone else here?
We have a problem of scale here. You guys talk about percentages of landowners, percentage of 50% owner can protest. Okay. You have a 90% of the land is, in your RCD thing. So do we tell Plum Creek 10% of your land is developable, 90% is not. Is that reasonable? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you saying 90% of this particular proposal on the table? It's a really different scale. They could come to the community or the county and say, I have 15 proposals. You're going to give them 10 or 15, 10% areas? Or are you just going to say, no, 10% of the land you own in this development district? That's really different. And then the other thing about Plum Creek is that they can manipulate the market because they own so much land. They can basically tell our whole community, forget it. They don't necessarily have our values. So somehow democracy got messed up here.
So what's your question?
I'm wondering if there's a way to deal with this. How do you get back to some sort of democratic value? Why participate if you have no power?
Did you want to comment on the earlier 90-10%?
Well, yeah, all I can say is that in Gallatin County, that's per parcel. That's just one parcel, 10% of it you can develop, 90% of it must be left as open space. That 10% is going to be determined by the landscape. You're going to have to keep it close to the road, keep it away from the best agricultural soils, keep it away from riparian areas, wildlife habitat, etc. I can't comment on Missoula County and how you determine, what that land base is in which to do the clustering. I don't know, Tim, if you can take that on or not.
I am not even going to attempt, because it just draws a little ire, to defend or say that the protest provisions are fair or democratic or not. They were established by the legislature in the mid-90s, I think, and that's what the legislature chose to do. And some people think it's legal. Some people think it's not. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, it's like you get two attorneys in a room and you have 5 opinions. So, and those are only if the attorneys are related. So, sorry, that's not fair. I apologize to all the attorneys in the room. Please, no slap suits against me. So I mean, it's not. I would not say it's democratic. I would say that's the way the law is written. And it was written that way primarily because zoning impacts property values. It impacts, I mean, it can enhance them. It was originally designed to enhance and protect property values from incompatible uses coming next door. And it can, in some cases, diminish them. And so, because landowners, those with the most land have the most, it can be impacted the greatest, that's why the legislature chose to do what they did. So it's, and like I said, without a plan, a growth policy, without implementation regulations, without zoning coming in, doesn't have the weight of law to be able to be enforced. Unless you have zoning, and the Supreme Court has recently talked about this as well. So, Michelle, do you want to?
As my understanding of the protest provisions is that they've been a sacred cow. In that to even sell the idea of zoning when it first came around in Montana, the legislature had to put that in to make it palatable to their constituents. And it's been there ever since, and people, every session almost, try to take it out, reduce it, and it never quite passes. So part of it, when you're talking about democracy, is to get your representatives to get it changed if you find it to be objectionable. So that's part of it. You also had a question about scale. And so one option would be to do the whole countywide zoning and wait. But I think the risk for your community in waiting to do the whole county is that things are going to happen right away. So that's the issue with the scale. You're in a little bit of a Hobson's choice in your community.
Way back there.
Thank you. After going to a presentation in Hamilton several weeks ago that the Department of Revenue for Montana put on about property taxes, I was wondering if any of you people had any kind of idea or input for these folks and of myself, what we can expect in the way of changes in property taxes and how our valuation might be affected by TDCs and that type of thing? Or if we end up in a receiving area as opposed to a sending area?
I don't know if we have any tax experts here, but.
No, I don't know. I mean, you know, the factors would be, how does it influence property values in both of those areas? Because property values are generally based upon comps, of course, or the property valuation, the comparable prices around there. But, you know, property taxes are also, can be set by the county in terms of how much money they need. And what we have found all over the country is that the more far-flung the development is, the more expensive it is for the county to service, so that generally locating your growth in more compact areas lowers county costs, lower property taxes, lower, you know, county tax rates. But it's just going to depend on mainly what it does to the property valuations in the area, and I certainly can't predict that.
Question back there? Okay. And then I think we can start taking the second question.
Okay. I just had a question concerning the protest rights for potential zoning. And it's been talked about repeatedly that the single largest landowner, or 50% of landowner, has a protest right. And then it's also mentioned, or 40% of the affected property holders. So does that mean that 40% of all of the landowners, or does the amount of land come into play there? Because I see a checkmate here for all the citizens of this community. And if you get 40%, if I'm right, 40% of landowners affected, they also can protest, which puts it on a 1-year hold scale, and then it can be protested indefinitely. On that same question, citizens-initiated zoning, that is also 40% of the landowners. And so if it is 1 year not able to be zoned, can activities be taking place for the citizens to pursue citizens-initiated zoning? And if they were to pass that, design it themselves and present it to the county commissioners, would the county commissioners be able to veto that?
I think that was 3 questions.
I'll start and then I'll let anyone else jump into that. Yes, there are 2 ways to protest. There's the in Part 2 county-initiated zoning. There's the landmass 50% or 40% of the landowners in that district. And it's not who are affected; it's who's if you're in that district. And then and I think this is I mean, you can't initiate, if it's protested out, you can't initiate zoning, and it doesn't clarify whether that's Part 1 or Part 2 zoning in that district for a year. So you can't come back with zoning whether it's I would say that it's clear enough that you could probably, the courts would probably, by the time you got out of court, the year would be over. So, so it's,
You can't establish it.
you can't establish it. You could work on it, you could plan it out, but you couldn't, the county couldn't come forward. On Part 1 zoning, it's not, just because you got passed to create the zoning district, you collected enough signatures to create the zoning district, does not guarantee that the commissioners who have the vote will pass the zoning district. There are counties in Montana who have said, we will not consider a citizen-initiated zoning district unless you show up with 100% of the landowners. I mean, if you show up with all the landowners, we'll vote for it. If you don't, we won't. And they have that, under statute, they have that authority. So it's not a veto, they have to proactively vote in the zoning district under Part 1 zoning. It's 40% of landowners within the district. I think for that purpose, they count as one. So yeah, however, that's where the land mass comes in, because then if they have, If they have 10 1-acre tracts, they then count as 10 acres within the land mass. So they get one. So. Oh, I'm going to pass that one. I'm not even going to try to touch that one. Ted will answer that one.
It's ambiguous. One note I wanted to make, though, about the stalemate is it's exactly that, a stalemate, and what you're left with is what you have now, which is no zoning.
Michelle, did you say something earlier? No? Okay. Okay. I'll get to you. You were farther away, so I'm going to go ahead first.
My question is a follow-up on the property tax. And it seems that there's a really interesting scenario in that once the TDRs are applied, the person in the sending unit really has land and a TDR to sell that has some value that he doesn't realize until he sells it. The receiving person has land and the ability to receive that can't realize it until they buy it. And I would assume the developer can purchase even without having land to apply it. Are there any examples of how the counties, apply the property tax? Because when you receive, you really haven't increased your property till you buy a TDR in the value. When you send, you really haven't lost a value until you sell. And if you're a developer and buy, you've increased value but have no use. Is there any examples of how they tax that?
I'll get the Department of Revenue on the phone. I can attempt to tackle that, but you have to remember I have a 6-year-old and her math baffles me. So in essence, the land that's valued as probably timberland here is what we're talking about, will still probably be valued as timberland. By Department of Revenue. It's not valued, just because even if you put an easement on it, it's not valued any less. It's going to be valued at the timber value. It's only valued, it would only be valued less if you were, I would say, in estate taxes. That's my read. The land in the receiving zone would only be changed, when it changed from, say, agricultural land to you chopped it up and started building houses, that's when the valuation would change. Or you might drop to, if you stopped running cattle on it and you stopped getting a certain amount of money that the department, I think it's $2,500, that the Department of Revenue requires to get a better agricultural tax valuation, if you stop doing that on it. But just because, for example, you could take a lot of ranches in Montana when the subdivision law went from 20 acres to 160 acres, people came in and chopped up their ranches into 20 acres, they're still valued as a whole, conglomerated as ag, even though somebody could go sell the 20 acres as individually. As soon as that 20 acres is sold for a house, then the valuation changes. Does that help? Or did I just confuse the issue? Don't get more complicated. I will attempt to repeat what he said. When does the value of the transfer come into effect for tax purposes? My understanding is that it's until it won't come into effect, and this may be wrong, so please forgive me, until the development begins to occur. Until that land changes use, then the Department of Revenue would and the counties would kick in. There isn't any way for the Department of Revenue to know otherwise, as far as I know. So that somebody can correct me.
You were shaking your heads yes. Do you have a little more certainty about that?
I would just agree with what Tim said. The Department of Revenue is going to base, their property valuation on the use of the land, and when it's developed, and there is market prices that they can, base that valuation on. That's when their their assessments would go up. But remember, that doesn't happen automatically. There's a cycle that the Department of Revenue works on. What is that, every 5 years or whatever that is, where they go out and reevaluate properties. So it's not necessarily automatically when a subdivision is created and houses are built on there that those property taxes would go up.
Did that come close to answering your question? Okay. One back here.
You don't know how often we get that.
I'm curious whether anyone is aware of any instances where the receiving area was 1 per 40 with absolutely no infrastructure.
Well, it depends on what you mean by absolutely no infrastructure.
No paved roads, nothing.
Well, I mean, the counties, that's still, as I think was mentioned, that's still going to be under subdivision review. And so a county is going to require that those roads are put in.
But I'm saying that that is what is being used as the receiving area.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there will be infrastructure put in before any development.
Right, but when all of you were talking, you were saying the desired receiving area has infrastructure. That's why you choose it. And I'm saying what's chosen is 1 per 40 with no infrastructure. That was what is chosen in the beginning as the receiving area.
Yeah, I think that the ability to put in infrastructure is the key. For instance, on the edge of Bozeman, where is a receiving area, and they want development. I mean, that's just, fields right now. Those are just meadows. There is no infrastructure there. But when the subdivision is put in, then of course the developer, whether or not they buy credits to increase their development rights, they will have to put in the infrastructure at that time. So it may not be.
Is that a 1 per 40 area?
It's a 1 per 20 area.
So you're not aware of a 1 per 40?
Correct. It's even higher density than 1 for 40, and there is no infrastructure. Correct.
One of the models I looked at in Colorado, they had variable incentives based on the amount of infrastructure there. And when a developer would put in additional infrastructure, that would affect the density incentives that they got. So it was this combination of trying to get the infrastructure there connected to the incentives. And so that's just another way of looking at the approach.
Okay, I'm going to take a second question. And then we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock. So we're going to wrap this up pretty quick.
Continuing with the hypothetical question, if there were a third party, a clearinghouse to accept development rights, could theoretically, if this was a land trust or something, could those rights conceivably be sold to another state or in another state?
There are programs in the country in which third-party buyers who have no intention of using those credits for development purchase them, speculate on them, assuming that they're going to gain value in time. Now, I know of no program, we talked about this a little bit earlier, where those credits can be used in another state. But we talked about interlocal agreements, maybe they could be used in another county. But there is some precedence for third-party buyer in them without any intention of using them, yeah.
Michelle,
Lake Tahoe is in both Nevada and California, and they did create a regional authority and have a transfer development program there. It's very different, but it at least is the foundation of that question. Yeah, it had congressional approval. I mean, if you get congressional approval, you're game.
Okay, like I said, we have to be out in 10 minutes, and Matt's going to tell you what the future holds. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you once again, everybody, for coming. I think this has been a really great event to get folks together to talk about growth patterns and some tools we can use to address them. You might have noticed we've endeavored to keep our discussion fairly broad tonight and talk about those tools without a whole lot of geographic context. That said, there is a planning effort going on in Seeley Lake, and your community council is working on an amendment to the growth policy, which they've been working on 2.5 years since I've been involved, and for quite some time prior to that as well. That community council meets the first Monday night of every month. They meet at 6 o'clock at the community hall. The land use plan is almost always on the agenda under old business and getting older. And certainly anyone is welcome to come to those meetings and work through some of these issues, to comment to the council as they deal with their draft of the plan. Additionally, the council has a subcommittee that's working specifically on some of the tools and issues that we've worked on and discussed today. That subcommittee's got a meeting coming up on April 23rd, 3 o'clock at the barn here in town, just to talk about these tools and not the entire broad plan. So both of those things are ongoing and coming up, and I would encourage anybody who wants to continue to participate in this process to do so. Seeley Lake has a few drafts of the land use plan they've been working on available. They're available through our website. If you go to the main Missoula County website, go to the Rural Initiatives Department, and look for the Seeley plan, you'll find past and current drafts of the plan and proposed revisions to the plan, as well as maps. More discussion than I can describe here is available there. And also, our staff at Rural Initiatives, primarily myself or my boss Pat, are available to citizens to answer questions about the plan, the process, where things are going, when the next meeting is, whatever you need. Just feel free to drop by our office, give us a call, shoot us an email. We'll certainly try to respond to those as we can. And once again, thank you to everybody for coming.
When will the minutes be on the website?
Currently, we don't host minutes for community councils on our website. We do for the Open Lands Advisory Commission. We do not host minutes for any of our community councils right now. It's primarily a managerial issue. We have 5 councils. Each of them is meeting once a month. Not all of them keep typewritten minutes. Some of them are handwritten. Most councils are pursuing the ability to post minutes on their own websites because it's simply going to be faster for them to establish those sites than it is to integrate into our county system. We are working toward that, however.
Is that the bar or the barn?
Barn.
Okay. Okay, thank you for coming tonight.